All right, welcome back to part 4 of this module. In this section, we're going to talk about how we choose a measurement system. So you just finished talking with Dawn about identifying the relevant dimensions of the behavior and really zeroing in on which part of the behavior is causing the problem and which part do we really want to measure. We're going to use that information to inform how we choose a measurement system here in part 4, and then we'll wrap it up in part 5, thinking about how we display this information and how we use it to make decisions. So when we think about determining the best procedure for measuring behavior, we got to start with a couple of big picture questions. First, start by thinking about who's going to take the data. If this is data that you're trying to collect while you're also teaching, it needs to be a much simpler process than if it's data that if that's their only job. They're coming in to do a student observation as part of an evaluation, and they're going to be observing, then they can collect a different type of data and a more intensive type of data collection. So thinking through what else is on the person's plate and who's going to be collecting the data is a really important first step when thinking about how you're going to measure behavior. Second, you're going to think about how that data is going to be collected. Do you need to do a direct observation, or are you going to use permanent products? And we'll talk about what those pieces mean, but thinking about how that data is going to be collected. And then finally, think about weighing practicality versus precision. So if you're doing a research study, you need to have really precise data. However, if you're teaching and you just need to know whether things are getting better or worse in your classroom, you don't need that same level of precision. What you need is something practical. But if it's not precise enough to measure change, then it's not worth collecting in the first place. So we really have to weigh that practicality versus precision piece and make sure it's something that's both feasible and useful for decision making. And so we're going to keep these big picture questions in mind as we think about choosing a particular system of measurement. And so there's a variety of different ways that we can measure behavior. We're going to think about what these are, and then we're going to map them back onto some specific dimensions of behavior that they're most useful for. So the first one we're going to talk about is anecdotal reports. So what are those? Anecdotal reports are just a written description of everything that's going on in a particular classroom. So these are just your observational notes where you're just writing down what's happening. The student engaged in this, the teacher did this, the peers did this. You're just writing down what's happening in a particular context, and so you get all of that rich information. It's particularly useful if you want to measure the dimensions of topography or locus, and sometimes force, because you can include that information in your anecdotal notes as well. It's great for helping you generate those operational definitions that we talked about, because you get lots of examples and lots of specific information about what the behavior looks like and what it doesn't look like. It's also really great for helping to develop a task analysis like we've talked about, really breaking down the steps of what's going on for a particular kid and what we want them to be able to engage in. And it can also help us with identifying those ABCs that we've been talking about from the very beginning of this module, those antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. And ABC charts are a particular type of anecdotal report where we're really focused on thinking about what are the antecedents, what does the behavior look like, and what are the consequences that are occurring right after that behavior occurs. So ABC charts are something that you've likely seen if you've been involved in special education evaluations or any kind of functional behavior analyses, but they're just a really specific type of anecdotal record. There's a variety of different ways to do those, but if you're engaged in these a lot, one strategy might be to think about creating codes for yourself. So instead of having to write out every single time, independent work, large group transition, just create a quick code for yourself, 1, 2, 3, 4. What are the particular consequence events that you're likely to see? Probably peer attention, adult attention, tangibles, escaping work are going to be the ones that you see most frequently. So create a code for yourself. And then when you go to collect the data, you're just quickly writing down those codes. So at 9 a.m., you saw antecedent number 1 and consequence B. And it makes the writing part much easier. So that makes it a little bit more feasible to collect good ABC information. And then you can summarize that information by looking at the percent of intervals that a student was engaged or was presented with a particular antecedent or consequence, and you can look for patterns in that way. There's lots and lots and lots of examples of good ABC charts. Not all of them use codes. Some of them are just the 3 columns where you can write your information in there. Check out this resource at ncii.org that will give you more information about how to do ABC charts and other examples of specific forms that you can use. The next type of measurement that we're going to talk about is permanent product. So what is a permanent product? Permanent products are just anything that comes out of a behavior. They're the tangible effects of a particular behavior. Things like completed work. How much of a particular assignment did a student complete? You collect the work. You see the student got half of their work done today, 3/4 of their work done the next day. That's a permanent product that's showing you how much work they're able to complete. Same is true for certain behaviors where there's destructive behavior. A student destroys materials in the classroom. That destroyed material is a permanent product that you can actually use to measure behavior. How much destruction occurred? How big is the hole in the wall? Those sorts of things. Using permanent products is particularly useful if you want to measure things like fluency of rate or rate of work completed. So things like how many math problems do we complete in a minute? You don't have to actually time and watch that. You can just collect the assignment at the end of a minute and you can get the answer to that. And so that's a really easy way to do that. Locus, topography, and force are other dimensions of behavior that can be measured with permanent products. So where did a particular fight occur? You can collect an assignment and look at the student's letter formation as a way to measure their topography of their handwriting. And like we talked about, you can measure the force of the amount of property destruction is another way to look at permanent products. So those are all different examples of when you might choose to use a permanent product. The next type of measurement system is an event-based system. This is really just a tally. This is just a count of the number of times a student engages in a particular behavior. So you watch the kid and you count how many times do they call out, how many times do they engage in a particular behavior. This strategy is particularly useful when we want to measure the frequency of things that don't happen super often, because we're trying to count these. If they're happening really, really quickly, it can be hard to count them. So we want to make sure that they're low enough frequency that counting is a feasible strategy. And it's also helpful that if these behaviors are discrete and that they're not things that can go on for different amounts of time. We want each instance of the behavior to be relatively similar. So things like number of curse words or number of times a student interrupts instruction would be good examples of things that you could count using an event-based system. You can also convert this to a rate by dividing by the amount of time. So if you observed for 15 minutes, you could count the number of behaviors that you saw, divide by 15 minutes, and get a rate, a number of occurrences per minute that would allow you to compare observations of different lengths to see whether a particular rate of a behavior is changing across time. So event-based systems are really simple. They're best used with low-frequency discrete behaviors and when you want to measure frequency or convert that into rate. So thinking about using that system, there's lots of ways to collect this information while you're teaching with just a tally in your lesson plan book or a golf counter or something on your tally on your phone. Any of those pieces are ways to collect event-based systems. Here's a couple of examples of a frequency recording tool that you could use. You just write down the start time, the stop time, and put a check or a tally mark in the box when you see that inappropriate talk-out behavior. So there's just a really quick example of one way you could collect this information. All right, the next system of measurement we're going to talk about is time-based estimates. So in this case, we're not trying to actually count how many times a behavior occurs. We're really looking to just estimate how much of the time is a student engaged in this behavior. So it's not as precise, but it does give us the opportunity to measure different types of behaviors. So we can use this for those high frequency discrete behaviors that are just happen too often and make it hard to count. Or we can use it for behaviors that are a longer duration, things like being on or off task that are hard to count with a discrete tally, but that we could estimate how much time is a student on or off task. And there's two different primary ways to do this. The first is interval recording that gets a slightly more accurate estimate of how often this is happening, but it's more difficult to actually collect the data. And the second is momentary time sampling, which is a more practical strategy if you're trying to do two things at once, like teach and collect the data. So we're going to show you what both of those look like. Let's start with interval recording. So we can do interval recording in two different ways. We can do whole interval recording, or we can do partial interval recording. And so to do interval recording, what we need to do is we need to take our observation period and we break it up into intervals. So if you're going to observe for 15 or 20 minutes, you might select 1-minute intervals or 30-second intervals or 2-minute intervals, depending on how precise you need to be. You divide your observation up into intervals, and then depending on the strategy you're using, you're going to check off if the behavior occurred during the whole interval or whether it only occurred during part of the interval. So obviously for whole interval recording, if the behavior occurred from the start of the interval to the end and it happened that entire time, then we're going to check off, yes, it happened during that interval. If we're using partial interval recording, if the behavior occurred at any point during that interval, we're going to check off yes, that it occurred during that time. And we're going to just get a check of did the behavior happen during a particular interval or not. And then we can summarize this using just a % of intervals that the behavior occurred in. So we might get a % of minutes during our observation that we saw this behavior, that we saw a student engaged in this particular behavior. Momentary time sampling is a little bit easier to do. So what this looks like is at the end of that particular interval, instead of having to watch for the entire interval, what you do is at the end of that interval, you quickly check in with the student and you see whether they're engaged in the behavior at that moment. And if they are, you check yes, and if they're not, you check no. But you don't have to watch the student for the entire interval. So this is something that's much easier to do if you're engaged in teaching, because you can just set a timer for yourself, look up at the end of your interval, yep, the kid is on task, mark it off, move on. You don't have to watch for the entire interval. So let's take a look at some examples. Let's pretend we're going to use 30-second intervals, and I'm just going to illustrate for you what this looks like. So if we're going to use 30-second intervals, and the behavior occurs during these blue times. So it happened for 30 seconds, there was a little break, it happened for another 30 seconds, and then 60 seconds, and so on. That's when the behavior actually occurs. Let's look at how we would record this behavior using these different strategies. So first, if we were going to use whole interval recording, we would check off, yes, the behavior happened this whole interval. It happened again here for this whole interval, here for the whole interval, and here for the whole interval, right? That's our whole interval recording. That gives us a summary that says the behavior occurred during 40% of intervals. If we were going to record that same behavior using partial interval recording, in this case we would put a check here, 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 and here, because the behavior occurred during part of each of those intervals. In this case, we get a summary score that said the behavior occurred 90% of intervals. So you see these are giving you different estimates. If we're using momentary time sampling, we're going to look up at the end of each interval, and we're going to determine whether or not the behavior was occurring then. So in this case, we would record that it happened here, 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 and that's it. So in this case, we recorded the behavior during 60% of intervals. So again, remember that practicality versus precision question? We really need to think about the type of strategy that we're using and determine how precise we need to be. Whole interval recording will tend to underestimate the occurrence of behavior, while partial interval recording, as you can see, tends to overestimate the occurrence of behavior. Momentary time sampling will likely come somewhere in the middle, but it really varies depending on your interval length. The real pro of that one is that it's just easier to use if you're trying to do other things. So we're going to ask you to stop for a second and do a little workbook quiz with us. So take a minute and see if you can decide which interval recording system you would use for each of these particular behaviors. So I'm going to give you a minute to complete it on your own, and then we will fill it in together. All right, so for the first one, if you wanted to measure a continuously desired behavior, something like on task, which one would you use? You might have chosen a whole interval recording system because it's something that you probably want to just get a general sense for. You want to know if it's happening the whole interval while you're going through there. If you want to record information on a behavior that occurs at a very high frequency and very rapidly, something like talking or head banging or hand flapping, partial interval recording might be a good way to do that. Did the behavior occur at any point during that interval? And finally, if you wanted to record something that's difficult to continuously monitor, so if you're trying to teach or do something else while you're also observing a student or collect data on other things, momentary time sampling might be a way to collect that information. All right, so our last system of measurement that we're going to talk about is time-based. And we're going to use this to measure either duration or latency. And it's pretty straightforward. This is just using time. So this is just starting a stopwatch when the instruction or behavior happens and stopping it when it stops. So if we want to measure something like latency, the time between when you give an instruction and when the student begins engaging in that particular behavior, we start the stopwatch when we give the instruction. We stop the stopwatch when the student starts the activity. That time is the duration of the latency of behavior. So it's a time-based measure of how long it takes the student to start a task. If we want to, we could also measure how long a behavior occurs. So when a student starts engaging in the behavior, we write down what time it is, or we start the stopwatch. And when they stop engaging in a behavior, we just stop the stopwatch. So we can use this to measure the duration of a particular behavior. Here's an example of how we could record that information. So in this case, we want to measure Jack's rocking in seat behavior. We just write down when it starts, write down when it stops. We can calculate how many minutes that was, and we get a total for the day. Here's another example, a teacher behavior example. If we want to measure specific praise that a teacher is engaging in, what dimension is this? Here's your options. If you want to remember back to that last section, remember the dimensions of behavior are frequency, rate, duration, latency, topography, force, and locus. Which one would we likely be most interested in for specific praise? Probably the frequency or the rate. In this case, we chose to measure the rate. If we want to measure rate, which measurement system might we choose? Remember, these are your options. So we chose to measure this using a tally of the teacher's behavior. So we actually gave the teacher a golf counter and checked off every single time we saw the teacher engage in this specific praise behavior. So we used a tally, an event-based measurement system, to measure this particular behavior. How about this example? If we want to measure a student's off-task behavior, let's start with what dimension of behavior are we probably most interested in? Probably we're thinking about the duration or the rate of behavior. If we want to know those two things, which measurement system might we want to use? So in this case, we used momentary time sampling. So at the end of each minute, we just checked off if student 1 was on task or off task. We did that because we were also engaged in collecting other information and we could not continuously monitor the student. But this gave us an estimate of how many minutes the student was engaged in on-task behavior. All right, now we want you to take a couple of minutes and do this stop and jot activity. Go back to the operational definition that you refined in activity 6.3. Think about the specific behavior and the particular dimension of behavior that you want to measure, and then select a measurement system that you think best matches that dimension. So use the dimension of behavior to help inform your choice. Which measurement system might you choose? Also weigh the practicality versus precision question. And then develop a quick data collection tool. We've given you a bunch of examples of what these look like. They are not complicated. They can be as simple as just tally marks on a piece of paper, but just jot down in your workbook what you think your data collection tool would look like for that particular behavior. All right, welcome back from that activity. Hope you've got some good ideas for how you're going to how you're going to develop your measurement system in your workbook. Remember, always be weighing that practicality versus precision question. Be thinking about, is this a feasible data collection system that I can really use on a regular basis to guide instruction in my classroom? And is it precise enough to give me information about whether behavior is getting better or worse? And that's really the important thing to be thinking about throughout the entire process while we're developing our measurement system.